Welcome to the second lecture in our lecture series about the Second Temple in Rabbinic Eyes. Today's lecture, The Siege of Jerusalem During the Hasmonean Civil War. Today we will explore the formation of the Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud story of an episode, the siege in the Hasmonean Civil War around the year 65 BCE. However, before reading the Babylonian, the story itself as it appears in the Babylonian Talmud, we have to read its context there, which is the Mishnah to which the story is then attached. So let us just dive right into things, and here's the Mishnah. Mishnah Sotah 9:14. During the war of Quietus, they decreed against bridal crowns and that a man should not teach his son Greek. Right? The War of Quietus is Lucius Quietus, who was a Roman general, and when the rabbis mention the War of Quietus, we take it to mean that they're referring to the diaspora revolt, which took place in Roman times between the years 115 and 117. Right? If we have the Great Revolt from the previous century, began in the year 66 with the destruction of the temple in 70, eventually the fall of Masada in 73, or perhaps 74, and then a number of decades later, we have this revolt, the diaspora revolt from 115 to 117, and then a little more than a decade later, there's going to be a third revolt, the Bar Kokhba revolt, from 132 to 135 or 136. And nowadays, I think scholars prefer to say 136. In any event, this is the second of the three revolts, and we hear two different decrees that the rabbis made at this time. They decreed against bridal crowns. The brides shouldn't use crowns on their heads as a symbol of mourning, so that you shouldn't use such crowns to signify mourning during this calamitous period. And a man should not teach his son Greek. This presumably refers to the Greek language, literary Greek. And this is the famous Mishnaic ban of teaching one's son Greek. Right? And as we hear from the context here, it's purportedly instituted during the time that the diaspora revolt was suppressed by the Roman general Quietus. Right? And that is the context in which our story will be brought. And let us continue now to the story. And that a man should not teach his son Greek, the Talmud cites the relevant line from the Mishnah, the Mishnaic ban on teaching Greek. Our rabbis taught, when the kings of the Hasmonean house fought one another, Hyrcanus was outside the temple, and Aristobulus within. Right? We have here the siege during the Hasmonean civil war between the brothers, who we call Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II, two sons of Alexander Yanai, which took place around the year 65 BCE. Okay? And we hear Hyrcanus is the one outside, he's the besieger, and Aristobulus is within, he is besieged. Each day, they used to let down from the temple denarii in a basket. So they must be Aristobulus and his people who were in the temple. They would let down money, denarii, in a basket, and Hyrcanus's people send up to them from outside the temple animals for the daily offerings. So we have a practical agreement here that even though there is a war going on and there's a siege on the city, since both sides are Jewish, so in order so that the daily offerings in the temple could go on during the siege, they've come to an agreement. Aristobulus' people send down money, and Hyrcanus' people send up animals, sheep, to be sacrificed. What's going to go wrong? Let's see. An old man there in the temple, who was familiar with the wisdom of Greek, spoke with them, Hyrcanus' besiegers, in the wisdom of Greek. Right? So we have some sort of communication here between an old man, as we will see, an old traitor in the city, in the temple, and Hyrcanus' besiegers outside, and he speaks to them in the wisdom of Greek. Okay? The wisdom of Greek, which, by the way, here is chokhmat Yevanit. It's a somewhat problematic term here. It really should be Chochma Yevanit or Chochmat HaYevanim, not Chochmat Yevanit. From a linguistic perspective, it's a slightly problematic term. It's also a term that only appears in the Babylonian Talmud, and there's much to be said about this term, but not in our context. But scholars do discuss what this term means in our context. Could it mean that he spoke to them in Greek? Did he speak to them in Greek philosophy, Chochmat Yevanit? Truth is, Rashi seems to be rather correct here when he explains that wisdom of Greek here must refer to some form of coded communication in Greek, some secret transmission of information. And this way, the old traitor, he can secretly transmit messages to the besiegers without alerting the other people inside the temple. Okay? I think Rashi's interpretation here is actually quite a good interpretation and sensitive to the literary context. Okay, so what did this old man say? He said to them, as long as they carry on the temple service, they will not be turned over to your hands. He's giving advice now to the besiegers, to Hyrcanus, and he's saying to them, as long as Aristobulus and his people, as long as they manage to continue the daily temple service, you're not going to be able to conquer the temple. Right? Okay? This is apparently a theological idea, a belief here, and he feels this is very good advice. And we're going to see they're going to follow this advice now. Let's move on. On the next day, they let down denarii, right? The Aristobulus' people are continuing their agreement. They let down denarii in a basket, and they, Hyrcanus' people, sent up a pig, okay? Which clearly, right, the quintessential non-kosher animal, and following the secret advice of the old trader, Hyrcanus' people send up a pig, and knowing that the Aristobulus and his people will not be able to sacrifice this pig. When it reached halfway up the wall, right, so imagine the pig being sent up, it stuck its claws in the wall of the temple, and the land of Israel was shaking for 400 parsangs. So, parsang is about, say, 5 kilometers. So the pig sticks its claws in the wall, and the land of Israel shakes. There's some sort of massive, can say, earthquake, right? On that hour, they said, "Cursed be a man who raises pigs, and cursed be a man who teaches his son the wisdom of Greek." Yeah? We have here 2 curses, right, from that hour, right? On that hour, right? On that hour, they said cursed and then cursed, right? One, as we see, one should not raise pigs. They learn that from the story. And one should not teach one's son the wisdom of Greek. Okay. And then there's more. We have the second on that hour. And on that hour, we learn the story of the Omer that came from the gardens of Tzrifim. Right? The Omer is the sheaf offering of freshly harvested grain for Pesach, which situates us in the time of Pesach. But the grain for that offering had to come from far off, from the gardens of Tzrifim. And the 2 loaves, which is an offering for Shavuot, they had to come from the valley of Ein Socher. In both cases, the idea being that the grains had to be brought to Jerusalem from distant locations, presumably because that disturbance we just heard of the land shaking, this calamitous agricultural experience meant that they had to bring the grains from distant locations. Okay? And this is our story as it appears here in Bavli Sota. Okay. So just in terms of the context, before we move on, let's say something about the context here. So the Sugya has linked this story of the Hasmonean civil war and the old traitor who betrays the temple to our Mishnah, which talks about the Mishnaic ban against teaching one's sons Greek. Natural question to ask is, well, what's actually the connection? It would seem at the end, you might say that when it said, cursed is the man cursed be a man who teaches his son the wisdom of Greek, is that supposed to be what our Mishnah is? In which case they're saying, this story was designed to tell us the ban, the Mishnaic ban in our Mishnah. The only problem with that is that there is a gap of almost 200 years between the events described in the story and the diaspora revolt. The diaspora revolt, as we said, between 115 and 117 CE, and our story presumably is taking place in around 65 BCE. So quite a large chronological gap. So one could say that the author or the editor of this sugya who brought our story maybe was unaware of the chronological gap or didn't really care about the chronological gap and was happy to bring the story. Alternative, some people suggest that no, it's not actually trying to say that our story led to the Mishnaic ban, but rather our story is a paradigm, it's a precedent, it's part of the background for what can happen due to the use of Greek wisdom or the Greek language, and it's giving a background for why eventually, later on in the War of Quietus, then they decided to actually ban it outright. And you could even say in our case it was only simply a curse in the time of the Hasmoneans, and later on they turned it into a ban, which is another take on how to view the story. Be that as it may, and how actually one wants to deal with the historical problem of linking our story to the Mishnah, what I'd like to do now with you is to talk about the formation of the story. And in particular, what I'd like to do is try to explore what sources are behind our story. What sources did the authors of our story, the author, the editor, from where did he derive inspiration, which then informed how he told our story. So let's open with twin Amoraic stories which appear in the Palestinian Talmud. It's good to remember the Palestinian Talmud is edited sometime around the year 380, and Babylonian Talmud not till much later, probably more than a century later. And let's see these two stories brought in Palestinian Talmud Ta'anit, in the sugya there, relating to the Mishnah, and the daily offering was canceled, which is talking about the different events that happened on the 17th of Tammuz. Right? We don't have to discuss the Mishnah now. Let's hear the stories that the Palestinian Talmud tells here. Rabbi Simon said in the name of Rabbi Joshua ben Levi, in the days of the Greek kingdom, so we're at some amorphous pre-Roman time, okay, some event, when the temple was besieged, they used to let down to them from the temple 2 baskets of gold. And they used to send up from the outside 2 sheep for the daily offerings. One time, they let down 2 baskets of gold, and they sent up to them 2 goats, which are unsuitable for the daily offering. Right? So we have a siege, we have an agreement between the besiegers and the besieged, they send down money, they send up animals, and then we have a violation of the agreement. In this case, they send up goats. And then, as we might expect based on the Bavli, on that hour, the Holy One, blessed be He, okay, the content's different, but we have they're relating to what happened at that hour. The Holy One, blessed be He, illuminated their eyes, and they found 2 lambs in the chamber of lambs. Oh, so they were saved that day. They found 2 lambs on the side where they could bring that day. Doesn't explain what happens the next day, but at least for that day they were okay. And on that hour, Rabbi Judah ben Abba testified that the daily morning offering is sacrificed until the 4th hour. There's 2 different events that happened on that hour, on the day when the besiegers sent up goats instead of sheep. And that was a tradition said in the name, Rabbi Simon said in the name of Rabbi Joshua ben Levi. Great. Let's move on to the second story here. It follows in the Palestinian Talmud, Ta'anit. And Rabbi Levi said, also in the days of this evil kingdom, okay, when the rabbis refer to the evil kingdom, they generally refer to the Romans. Okay? So also in the days of this evil kingdom, we've moved from some amorphous Greek kingdom to the Roman kingdom. They used to let down to them from the temple 2 baskets of gold. And they would send up to them from outside 2 sheep, our familiar agreement. But in the end, They let down to them 2 baskets of gold, and they sent up to them 2 pigs. Okay? Those 2 pigs, did not reach halfway up the wall when a pig groaned and jumped 40 parsangs from the land of Israel. Right? So here we are quite familiar to us. Now we have 2 pigs, but the pig's going up. Halfway up the wall, a pig groans, and then it, not the land of Israel, it jumps 40, not 400 parsangs from the land of Israel. And then once again, on that hour, the sins of the Jews caused that the daily offering be canceled and the temple destroyed. And we have this after the story. Here it's 1 on that hour, not 2, but this is also as we find in the Babylonian Talmud. Okay. So there are structural similarities between our Babylonian story and these 2 Palestinian versions. Let's talk about some of the issues here. We have a story of besieged Jerusalem. If I refer to the first story, a besieged Jerusalem in pre-Roman times, which is also our case in the Babylonian account. We have the same practice, sending up animals, sending down money for those animals. We then have it disrupted, right? When the people sending up, the besiegers, do not send up. In the first case, they send up 2 goats instead. And then we have on that hour and twin events. Okay? In the second Palestinian story, we're in Roman times, so we're in a different period, but we also have the besiegers and the besieged and the agreement. Here, a little closer to the Babylonian story, we have them send up the pig, okay? And about halfway up the wall, the pig causes reverberations, just as it does in the Babylonian story. Beyond the structural similarities, something which I didn't do now here, but if you read the text in Hebrew, you could also see, there is quite a lot of the same language in the Palestinian stories as the Babylonian account, and they appear in the same order. These phrases, exact mamash, the same language appears in both. So these very strong structural and linguistic similarities between the twin Palestinian stories and the Babylonian story would indicate that there's a genetic connection, a real connection between them, and that, say, one story is dependent on the others. And 4 considerations, I'd like to explain now. 4 considerations basically well establish that the Babylonian version is dependent on the Palestinian stories. And I will explain the 4 considerations. First consideration simply has to do with the time of the editing of the works. As we noted before, the Babylonian Talmud is edited long after the Palestinian Talmud. This does not mean that the Babylonian Talmud can't have materials that are earlier than the Palestinian Talmud, but everything being equal, that would be our default position. And since we're dealing with a much later work, our default position is if you have a shared tradition, it's most likely that the Palestinian Talmud has an earlier version, the Babylonian Talmud a later version. And in order to argue otherwise, you have to make a very good case. It is possible, but it is not our default position. That's reason number 1. Reason number 2, the centerpiece of the Babylonian story, the old traitor, is missing from the Palestinian accounts. Right? He's not there. There's no role for him. The disruption happens, nothing to do with an old traitor. And it is far more likely that the old traitor was added into the story in the Babylonian account than that he was removed from the earlier accounts. In general, there's also a concept in philology of preferring a shorter version of an account. Don't even have to go there, but just in comparing these 2 stories, it seems much more likely that someone would have added in this old traitor than that someone would have removed him from the story. Third reason, we have 2 separate stories in the Palestinian Talmud here, and elements from both stories appear in our Babylonian story. For example, the pre-Roman context, well, that only appears in the first story. The 2 on that hour, that only appears in the first story. But the pig only appears in the second story. The jump only appears in the second story. You would seem to have here a conflation from these 2 stories. And it seems far more likely that the Babylonian Talmud conflated what appears here in 2 adjacent stories then that our original story, say, was the Babylonian Talmud story, and then the elements were separated into two different stories and then attributed to two different figures from two different periods. There are different layers here of the Palestinian Talmud, and that seems far more unlikely. What seems far more likely is that the Palestinian Talmud, as the earlier text existed, we have here two adjacent stories, and the Babylonian Talmud, which drew inspiration from this text, conflated elements from both stories, and in its creation of a new version of the story. That was our third reason, right? So far we said just simply the relative timing of the editing of the two works. The centerpiece of the Babylonian story is missing from the Palestinian accounts, most likely was added. And now conflation of the literary elements in the two adjacent stories into a single story is more likely than they're being separated out and then placed in two different stories. And our fourth consideration has to do with the pig. The context for the pig in the Palestinian Talmud is much better than the context in the Babylonian Talmud. For one, the pigs were a symbol for Rome, and it's the context of a Roman siege where the pigs appear in the Palestinian Talmud, and that is a much more natural setting for the appearance of pigs than Hyrcanus, who's Jewish, for then his siege in the Babylonian account. Another element linked to the pig, we have the jump of the pig in the Palestinian Talmud becomes the land of Israel, shaking or jumping in the Babylonian Talmud, and the 40 parsangs becomes 400 parsangs, and these are sort of typical exaggerations of Babylonian reworking of stories. We are familiar to this from many other stories where the Babylonian Talmud has an inclination to exaggerate different elements in its stories. In light of these four considerations, it seems a rather fair conclusion that the Babylonian Talmud was familiar with these two stories in this sugya in Yerushalmi Ta'anit, and that it drew inspiration from them when it reworked our story. Okay. With that being said, so these were two very important sources for our story, but they're not the only. They don't exhaust all the information in our story, and there are other elements which the Babylonian Talmud learned from elsewhere. So, for example, Hyrcanus and Aristobulus do not appear in the Palestinian accounts, and for them, we will move to Josephus and see how we can find a similar story to our story in Josephus's Antiquities, and let's see his story. And so when Antipater saw that Hyrcanus was paying no attention to what he said, Antipater, Herod's father, who is an advisor of Hyrcanus, our Hyrcanus II, was paying no attention to what he said. He did not let a day go by without bringing false charges against Aristobulus before him and slandering him by saying that he wished to kill Hyrcanus. So Antipater is telling Hyrcanus that Aristobulus is against him and wants to kill him. And by dint of constant pressure, he persuaded him to take his advice and flee to Aretas, the Arab king, promising that if he followed his advice, he too would be his ally. So Antipater is convincing Hyrcanus to join Aretas. When Hyrcanus heard that this would be to his advantage, he was ready to flee to Aretas, for Arabia borders on Judea. However, he first sent Antipater to the Arab king to receive sworn assurances that if he came to him as a suppliant, Aretas would not deliver him up to his enemies. When Antipater had received these sworn assurances, he returned to Hyrcanus at Jerusalem, and not long afterwards he slipped out of the city by night. See? Taking Hyrcanus with him, and after traveling a great distance, brought him to the city called Petra, where the palace of Aretas was. Right, so now we have Antipater and Hyrcanus going to Aretas at Petra. Being a very good friend of the king, he urged him to bring Hyrcanus back to Judea. And as he did this every day without intermission and offered him gifts in addition, he finally persuaded Aretas. Moreover, Hyrcanus also promised him that if he were restored and received his throne, he would return to him the territory and the 12 cities which his father Alexander Yanai had taken from the Arabs. These were Medba, and then Josephus notes the names of the cities, which I skipped here, of which he will return. Because of these promises which were made to him, Aretas marched against Aristobulus with an army of 50,000 horsemen and foot soldiers as well, and defeated him in battle. After his victory, many of these Jews deserted to Hyrcanus, and Aristobulus, being left alone, fled to Jerusalem. Thereupon the Arab king took his whole army and attacked the temple, where he besieged Aristobulus, and the citizens, joining Hyrcanus' side, assisted him in the siege, while only the priests remained loyal to Aristobulus. So here we have the scene we saw also in the Bavli, where Aristobulus and the priests, we're told, were inside there on the temple. Hyrcanus is outside, and he has the help of Aretas and his Arab army. And so Aretas placed the camps of the Arabs and Jews next to one another and pressed the siege vigorously. But as this action took place at the time of observing the festival of unleavened bread, which we call Pesach, the Jews of best repute left the country and fled to Egypt. Oh, and like we saw also in the Babylonian Talmud, perhaps we're not surprised here, we hear of that we're in the time of Pesach. Okay. Let's continue in Josephus. Now there was a certain Ananias, who being a righteous man and dear to God, had once in a rainless period prayed to God to end the drought. And God had heard his prayer and sent rain. This man hid himself. So we're told here, Josephus is telling us of a certain man named Ananias, who once prayed for rain and successfully brought the rain. This tradition will eventually appear once again in rabbinic literature, in the Mishnah, and will become the story of Choni HaMe'agel. Okay, but that's not of our concern now. Let's see what happens here. This man hid himself when he saw that the civil war continued to rage, but he was taken to the camp of the Jews and was asked to place a curse on Aristobulus and his fellow rebels, just as he had by his prayers put an end to the rainless period. So Hyrcanus' people are asking this Onias to help them, pray for them so that they should win in the war against Aristobulus. But when, in spite of his refusals and excuses, he was forced to speak by the mob, he stood up in their midst and said, O God, King of the universe, since these men standing beside me are thy people, and those who are besieged are thy priests, I beseech thee not to hearken to them against these men, nor to bring to pass what these men ask thee to do to those others. Since both the besiegers and the besieged are Jews, Ananias says, please don't help anyone. And when he had prayed in this manner, the villains among the Jews who stood round him stoned him to death. Right? And this is Ananias' end. Because he was not willing to help them out, there are Jews who murder him. But God straightway punished them for this savagery and exacted satisfaction for the murder of Ananias in the following manner. While the priests in Aristobulus were being besieged, there happened to come round the festival called Pesach, at which it is our custom to offer numerous sacrifices to God. But as Aristobulus and those with him lacked victims, they lacked animals for the sacrifices, they asked their countrymen to furnish them with these and take as much money for the victims as they wished. And when these others demanded that they pay 1,000 drachmas for each animal they wished to get, Aristobulus and the priests willingly accepted this price and gave them the money which they let down from the walls by a rope. And we have here a similar story where they're, I say similar because we're dealing here with Pesach, not the daily sacrifice, but other than that we have here the same agreement. The besieged are giving money, they're sending down money from the temple, and the besiegers are supposed to send up animals, in this case not for the daily sacrifice, but for the Pesach sacrifices. Their countrymen, however, after receiving the money, did not deliver the victims, but went to such lengths of villainy that they violated their pledges and acted impiously toward God by not furnishing the sacrificial victims to those who were in need of them. Right? And this we almost expect, well, I think we do expect, that the besiegers violate the agreement and do not give the animals that they promised. But the priests, on suffering this breach of faith, prayed to God to exact satisfaction on their behalf from their countrymen, and he did not delay their punishment, but sent a mighty and violent wind to destroy the crops of the entire country, so that the people at that time had to pay 11 drachmas for a modius of wheat. So, and after the violation of the agreement, we then have here the destruction of crops, and so that the people at that time, right, they had to pay 11 drachmas for a modius of wheat. There are no crops around. So we have here a number of elements that we did not find in the Yerushalmi's account. Of course, we see we're dealing with basically the same story of the agreement of sending down money, sending up animals for sacrifice, and then that agreement is violated. In this case, it's about the Pesach sacrifice, not the daily sacrifice. That will be changed. And we have here the time of year, which we did not have in the Palestinian Talmud. And we also have here the destruction of crops, which echoes in our Babylonian story, where they have to bring, both for the Omer and the Shtei HaLechem, the different offerings for Pesach and Shavuot, they have to bring the grain from far away. So it would seem that various elements from Josephus' account make it to the rabbis. This does not mean that the rabbis read Josephus or knew Josephus' text. It seems the story that Josephus is telling somehow or other makes it to the rabbis, and we see here various elements that were missing from the Palestinian account but appear there. And we will get back to Josephus shortly, but it would seem to me that we've found a number of other elements that we didn't have from the Palestinian account. We found Hyrcanos, we found the time of year, we found the destruction of crops. All this which did not appear in the Palestinian Talmud but appears here in Josephus' tradition. We mentioned there were two curses, right? We saw the two curses at the end of the story, and we already saw that our story was brought in the context of the Mishnaic ban against Greek, which I would suggest that actually was the inspiration for the first curse. I'm sorry, other people have suggested that too. I said, no, that seems to be a good suggestion. And the second one of not a curse against raising pigs elsewhere. So if we see also in Mishnah Bava Kama, an Israelite may not raise pigs anywhere. In essence, the two curses at the end of our story actually seem to be deriving inspiration from two Mishnayot, one about not teaching one's son Greek and one about not raising pigs. Okay. So we've located many elements of our story. Okay? We have the agreement. We have the violation of the agreement. We have Hyrcanos and Aristobulus. We have the daily offering, right? We have the time of year. We have the agricultural calamity, right? But what about sort of the centerpiece of the story, the old traitor, right? We have not yet seen the old traitor in any of our sources, okay? So now I'd like to relate to a fascinating claim made by Vered Noam in a very important book that came out a number of years ago, where Vered Noam and Tal Ilan and a group of scholars put together a massive research project where they analyzed parallels between the rabbis and Josephus. And in this important book, Vered Noam comments on our issue and the old traitor, and I'd like to discuss what she says, and then, as you'll see, also disagree with what she says, but it also gives us a very good foil for developing this idea further of where the old traitor came from. And let's see Vered Noam's argument. I would like to argue that in reference to the deep message of the story, it is the Talmudic version which reflects the original, and Josephus the secondary erasure. Right? So contrary to what I argued above, Noam is of the opinion that the Talmudic account here actually has an earlier version of our story, Talmudic being the Babylonian Talmud's account. This conclusion is drawn from elements found in Josephus' own account. The story of Onias, which was not preserved in rabbinic literature, right? The rabbis only have the story of Onias, of Choni, praying for rain. They do not have the story where Hyrcanos' people asked him to pray on their behalf. So the story of Onias, which was not preserved in rabbinic literature, clearly reflects the same message as that which emerges from the Talmudic version of the sacrifice story. In the story of Onias, even as it is mediated by Josephus, it states clearly that those seeking a resolution by means of Onias' prayer are wicked, while the righteous, beloved of God, adamantly refuse to wish victory for one Jewish side over the other, and believes that God will never aid either one of the hawkish sides, for the chosenness of Israel requires their unity. In other words, the two stories, that of the sacrifices in the Talmudic version and that of Ananias in Josephus' version, preach for unity and teach that a sacrifice or prayer will not help one Jewish camp against the other. Moreover, the stories have an antithetical relationship. One is a mirror image of the other. In both stories appear an old man. Actually, Ananias is actually never called here an old man, but okay. In one, he is righteous, beloved of God. In the other, he is a villain and represents foreign culture. In the first story, the warriors address the old man with a demand. In the second, the old man addresses the warrior with advice. Let's see how she finishes here. The old man in the first story, Ananias, works to prevent a resolution and preserve the status quo. The old man in the second story works to violate the unity. The old man in the first story dies by the hands of those around him. The old man in the second story brings calamity on others. The two different stories, the murder of Ananias, unique to Josephus, and the story of the sacrifices, specifically in its Talmudic version, belong thus to the same unique historical context, carry the same message, and are fashioned with the very same literary pattern as mirror image stories. So Noam has an argument here that our story of the old traitor betraying the besieged is a mirror image story of that of Ananias. Ananias is a good Jew who will not betray anyone and will not help one side conquer the other. And the flip side, or the mirror image of this Ananias, is the old traitor in our story. And in our story, that's exactly what the old traitor does. He betrays Aristobulus, the people inside, in order to help Hyrcanus outside. Let's see how she concludes. Therefore, it seems that both existed in the early context, which included both stories as one, and consequently Josephus brought them one after the other. Since these stories, Noam argues, are rather similar, and one is the antithesis of the other, they're mirror images, she thinks this gives literary warrant to say they were together. As a result, we may assume that those very features of the Talmudic story shared by the story of Ananias, which the Talmud did not know, do not stem from a late Talmudic reworking, but existed in the original story. These are the message of unity and the figure of the traitorous old man. But these elements, i.e. the internal Jewish point of view and basic antipathy for Greco-Roman culture, had to be censored when they entered Josephus' narrative, and so he intentionally omitted them. In other words, Noam is arguing that our story in the Babylonian Talmud, even though it doesn't appear in the Palestinian Talmud, and even though it doesn't appear in Josephus, that traitorous old man, he is an original part of the story, right? And Josephus omitted him because of the Chochmat Yevanit, because he was using Greek culture, and because Josephus had a very favorable view of Greek culture, he omitted this element from the story and left out the old traitor. Okay? And this is Noam's argument for making the case that this one element, which we didn't yet find a source for, stems from an early Second Temple tradition, which even Josephus knew. Okay. In my opinion, this is a very clever interpretation, but there still is really no evidence for what Noam is maintaining here. And in all likelihood, still based on the four arguments we gave above, and with our recognition of how the Babylonian Talmud freely reworks its sources, even if I stopped here, I think it's still more likely that the Babylonian Talmud, its tradition, has added in this traitorous old man, rather than Josephus knew the traitorous old man and decided to expunge him from the story. I won't repeat the four considerations we mentioned above, but I think those four still are stronger than this argument. It's simply more simple to presume, or to assume that what we have in Josephus is what he knew, and what we have in the Babylonian Talmud is a later addition, rather than arguing that Josephus actually had this and decided to expunge it. I'll just also mention the problem that that Chochmat Yevanit phrase seems to be a special phrase of the Babylonian Talmud also, but that's really a side issue. In any event, what I'd like to try to do now is to make the case that we actually can find the source of inspiration also for this traitorous old man. Okay? And I think there are two relevant sources which can help us find from where did the Babylonian Talmud get this idea. Okay. The notion that let's take a look here. We're going to go to Palestinian Talmud Sota. Okay? And here we're hearing that the notion that the ban against things Greek was enacted in reaction to traitorous informers. So look at what happens here. Source 5 here. They asked Rabbi Joshua, may a man teach his son Greek? Rabbi Abba, Rabbi Chia bar Abba's son, said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, the true rationale for prohibiting Greek is because of informers, so as to hinder their communication with the enemy. Here, in an earlier Palestinian tradition, with no story, simply a tradition, the Palestinian Talmud has a tradition that the ban against things Greek, why is it bad to teach your sons Greek? Because of the potential danger of them becoming informers. Right? And what it seems to me we have here in the Palestinian Talmud, an earlier tradition giving the rationale for a prohibition against teaching Greek, and in the Babylonian Talmud, this tradition of just simply a rationale is then narrativized. It becomes a story. And this is a phenomenon we find quite a bit in antiquity, where traditions which don't have a story, over time are then developed into stories. They give them a story. And that's what I think we have in our case, where the traitorous old man, why bring a traitor into the story? Oh, because we have a tradition. We understand that the rationale for not wanting to teach your son Greek or Greek wisdom is so that they shouldn't become informers. But we'll go one step further, and I want to suggest that the detailed portrait of what the old traitor actually do was inspired by a literary figure who appears in Yerushalmi Ta'anit just a little bit after the parallel twin stories we cited at the beginning of this lecture. And we move on. Let's see what this story is. Okay? 3.5 years did Hadrian besiege Beitar. Okay? We have moved on to the Bar Kokhba revolt. We're towards the end of the Bar Kokhba revolt, say in the year 136. And Rabbi Elazar HaModai would sit on sackcloth, on ashes, and pray every day. So Rabbi Elazar HaModai is inside Beitar and he's praying. And what does he say? Master of the world, do not sit in judgment today. Do not sit in judgment today. Okay. So Rabbi Elazar HaModai is praying here that God should not sit in judgment, and thereby he is safeguarding the city from destruction. Hadrian wanted to go on his way. Hadrian, the Roman general besieging the emperor, besieging the city, he wants to give up. He wants to go home. A Samaritan said to him, do not go on your way, for I see what to do to hand over the city to you. So there's a Samaritan there who says, no, don't give up yet. I know a way that you will be able to conquer the city. So the Samaritan entered through a duct of the city. He entered and found Rabbi Elazar HaModai standing and praying. He pretended to whisper to him into his ear. So he's pretending. He comes to Rabbi Elazar HaModai and whispers something in his ear. The people of the city saw him, and they brought him before Ben Koziba, Bar Kokhba. They said to him, we saw this old man speaking to your uncle. Right? We saw this Samaritan, this old man, our old traitor, the old man, speaking to Elazar HaModai. He, Ben Koziba, the rabbinic name for Bar Kokhba, said to him, the Samaritan, the rabbinic name here, right? Bar Kokhba is elsewhere, but it's the same person. Don't have to go into that now. What did you say to him, and what did he say to you? So what does the Samaritan reply when he's questioned by Ben Koziba? He said to him, if I say to you, the king, Hadrian, will kill me, and if I do not say to you, you will kill me. Better the king kill me and not you. So the Samaritan is going to say what he said. He, the Samaritan, said to him, to Koziba, ben Koziba, he said to me, I shall hand over the city. That's what the Samaritan now reports that Rabbi Elazar Modai said to him. He came before Rabbi Elazar Modai and said to him, what did this Samaritan say to you? And what does Rabbi Elazar Modai say? He said to him, nothing. What did you say to him? He said to him, nothing. Because in truth, they didn't really have a conversation. It was all pretend. So Bar Kochva here, ben Koziba, he gave him one kick and killed him. He kills Elazar Modai. Immediately a voice came out and said, "O the worthless shepherd who abandons the flock, let a sword descend upon his arm and upon his right eye. His arm shall shrivel up, his right eye shall go blind." You killed Rabbi Elazar HaModai, the right arm of all of Israel and their right eye. Therefore let the right arm of that man utterly wither, and let his right eye be utterly blinded. Immediately, Beitar was taken and Ben Koziba killed. In this story, during the Bar Kochba revolt, we have Rabbi Elazar Modai's daily prayers. And these daily prayers are safeguarding a besieged fortress. And that is precisely parallel to the daily offerings in the Babylonian Talmud story, where we don't have prayer, we have offerings. There's a daily offering, and the daily offering is preserving, it's keeping the temple intact. Like in the Babylonian story, we have a traitorous old man. So here we have a conniving, a traitorous old Samaritan who understands, just as our traitorous man in the Babylonian story, that the siege will never succeed so long as this continuous religious service is going on. Okay? So in both cases, both stories, the key to translating the siege into victory is to disrupt the daily service. So in the Babylonian story, the traitorous old man says, you have to stop sending up the message is, you have to stop the sacrifices. And just like here, the Samaritan goes in and he figures out a way to stop Rabbi Elazar Modai from his daily prayer. In the end, of course, Bar Kochva kills him. So we have both stories spotlighting an old man within the besieged fortress who betrays the besieged to their enemies at the gate, and he does it by, the point is to break, to disrupt the continual service within the siege which had been protecting the besieged. So I would like to suggest that not only did we see in the Palestinian Talmud the notion that not teaching your son Greek, well, that's because you don't want him to become a traitorous informer. And now we have a story, albeit a story from Bar Kochba time, but from a literary perspective, it is in the same sugya in the Palestinian Talmud where we read the two earlier stories. And the truth is, our story in the Babylonian Talmud continues, and there's even more material which stems from the same sugya. And the literary paradigm of the old man, not only the basic siege of the plot line and the daily exchange and the pig and its consequences and the jumping and the parsangs, not only did all of that come from the Palestinian Talmud sugya, but now we even see later on that the traitorous old man, he also comes from that context. Right? We don't have to assume there was a historical kernel here. We don't have to assume that this went back to a Second Temple tradition. We can see here how the authors of our story in the Babylonian Talmud were reworking earlier literary materials that they were familiar with. Now, we've tried here to sort of uncover the work table of the author of our story, or the authors of our story, and to see how he drew different elements from different places. He has this Palestinian Talmud sugya. He knows elements in the tradition which we know from Josephus. He's familiar with the two Mishnayot, banning Greek, not raising pigs. And with the help of these different materials, he forms a new story. We can take apart some of the pieces and figure out where they come from. He streamlined them all and then created a new story. Now, in our previous lecture, we saw how the holiday of Purim and Megillat Esther helped inform a rabbinic story where Alexander the Great meeting the high priest. That story was informed by a biblical paradigm, something from, say, way back in the past, which when they told the story, when the rabbis reworked the legend of Alexander the Great and the high priest, they drew inspiration from a biblical paradigm. Now, what we're seeing in this case, quite fascinatingly, something a little reverse, is that here they're taking inspiration. We saw the traitorous old man, while they're telling the story about a siege from 65 BCE, right? They're drawing inspiration from a later story told about the Bar Kokhba revolt 200 years later. And drawing inspiration from this traitorous, this conniving Samaritan in the story of the Palestinian Talmud story about the fall of Beitar, the rabbis rewrite the story of the siege of Jerusalem during the time of the Hasmonean revolt. Thank you.